It's late. I'm glad you're here. I'm Tim. If you're new, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Whatever you were carrying today, you can set it down at the door. It'll still be there in the morning if you want it back. 4 stories tonight. The first is about a retired Coast Guard officer in Port Angeles, Washington, who gets a call one Tuesday morning about a lighthouse he was involved in automating in 1988, and about the man who was the last keeper of it, and about what that man told him at the top of the tower on the final afternoon. The second is about a saturation diver on an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico, and what he sees at 340 feet on a Tuesday in March, and about what he decides to do with the rest of his life afterward. The third is about an estate sale coordinator in Providence, Rhode Island, and about 12 reels of home movies she finds in the attic of a woman who has died at 91, and about the figure that is in the background of every scene. The fourth is about a woman who moved 3 years ago to a small town in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, and about the sound she comes to hear on Sunday mornings after the bell rings at the First Baptist Church. Long ones. Tonight, the kind you settle into. You don't have to keep up. You don't have to remember any of it in the morning. If your eyes get heavy in the middle of one, that's the whole point. I'll keep talking. You'll drift. The stories will keep going. A like helps another tired person find their way here on some long night. A subscribe brings me back to you on the next one. So settle in. Pull the blanket up. Let the day fall away. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. When you're ready, we'll begin. Merwin Halstead was 64 years old and had been retired from the Coast Guard for 24 years when the call came in on the last Tuesday of September 2026 at 7:18 in the morning. He was in the kitchen of his house on Cherry Hill Lane in Port Angeles, Washington. He was drinking coffee at the small table by the window. He had been up since 5. The way he had been up since 5 for most of his life, and he had done the crossword in the Peninsula Daily News and had eaten 2 eggs and a piece of toast. And he was watching the fog burn off the strait when the phone rang. He looked at it. He got up, walked to the wall by the refrigerator, and picked it up. He said, "Halstead." The voice on the other end said, "Chief Halstead. This is Lieutenant Vance Ockery, Coast Guard Sector Puget Sound, Seattle," Merwin said. "Lieutenant Vance said, sir. I hope I'm not calling too early." Merwin said, "I've been up 2 hours. Go ahead." Vance said, "Sir, I'm calling about the light at Point Ray." Merwin was quiet for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the strait. The fog was lifting off the water. Vancouver Island was coming out of it slowly, in the way it did on cold mornings in September. He said, "Point Ray." Vance said, "Yes, sir, on the outer coast, between Ozette and Nia Bay." Merwin said, "I know where Point Ray is, Lieutenant." Vance said, "Of course, sir." Merwin said, "Automated, 1988. I was the officer of record." Vance said, "Yes, sir. That's why I'm calling you." Merwin said, "What's wrong with the light?" Vance was quiet on his end for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, the light has been having difficulties for about 11 months now." Merwin said, "What kind of difficulties?" Vance said, "It goes out." Merwin said, "Bulbs?" Vance said, "No, sir, not the bulbs. The bulbs are fine. The generator is fine. The batteries are fine. The whole system is fine, sir, when the maintenance crew is out there. They test it and it runs. They leave and it runs. Then at some point it goes out." Merwin said, "For how long?" Vance said, Anywhere from 3 minutes to 11 hours. Merwin said, 11 hours. Vance said, yes, sir. Last month it went dark, from midnight to just after 11 a.m. Then came back on by itself. When the crew got out there the next day, everything was operating as normal. They cannot find a cause. Merwin drank the rest of his coffee. He set the cup on the counter. He said, have you had a Marine casualty? Vance said, no, sir. No ships have gone up. There isn't a lot of traffic on that stretch of coast, which is one of the reasons for the original automation decision, as I understand it. Merwin said, that was the reason. Vance said, yes, sir. Merwin said, so no casualties. What's the concern? Vance said, well, sir, the light is supposed to be on. It isn't. We have a broken light that our engineers cannot fix. We have run every diagnostic. We have replaced every component. We have logged every failure. Nothing matches. Sir, I understand you were the automation officer in '88. Merwin said, I was. Vance said, and I understand you have some familiarity with the light and with the last keeper. Merwin said, I do. Vance said, sir, I would like to ask you if you would be willing to go out to Point Ray with a small crew, look the situation over, and give us your best assessment. Consulting basis. We would put you up. We would compensate you. Merwin looked out the kitchen window. The fog in the strait was almost gone now. He could see the outline of the Sook Hills across the water. A small tug was working its way east toward Port Angeles, pulling a barge. He said, when? Vance said. As soon as you can, sir, Merwin said. I could be out there tomorrow. Vance said, that would be excellent, sir, Merwin said. I'll drive myself. I know the road. Vance said, yes, sir. The crew will meet you at the landing at the base of the headland at 10 in the morning, if that works. Merwin said, 10 works. I'll be there. Vance said, thank you, sir. Merwin said, Lieutenant. Vance said, yes, sir. Merwin said, Wendell Grieve. There was a pause on the line. Vance said, sir. Merwin said, the last keeper. Wendell Grieve, did you know him? Vance said, no, sir. I was a boy in '88. Merwin said, he died in '91 in Neah Bay. Vance said, yes, sir, that's in the file. Merwin said, I'll see you tomorrow at 10. Vance said, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Merwin hung up. He stood in his kitchen for a moment with his hand on the receiver. He thought about Wendell Grieve. He had not, in 24 years of retirement, thought about Wendell Grieve very often. Wendell had been at the light for 17 years when Merwin had come out in '88 with the automation crew. Wendell had been 51 at the time. He had been a lean man with gray hair and gray eyes, and the weathered face of a man who had spent 17 years on a rock in the Pacific. He had been civil to Merwin the whole 3 weeks of the automation build-out. He had been unhelpful, in a quiet way. He had not sabotaged anything. He had answered questions when asked. He had not volunteered information. At the end of the 3 weeks, when the automation was tested and running and the Coast Guard was ready to close the keeper's quarters and take Wendell back to the mainland for his retirement, out processing, Wendell had asked to speak to Merwin. They had walked to the top of the tower together. It had been late afternoon. The sun had been low over the Pacific. Wendell had said, Chief Halstead, I need you to know something. Merwin had said, go ahead. Wendell had said, the light isn't for the ships. Merwin had said, the light. Wendell had said, the Point Ray light. It isn't for the ships. There aren't any ships. There haven't been ships past here in 50 years. Merwin had said, I know that. Wendell, that's why we're automating. Wendell had said, then what do you think it's for? Merwin had looked at him. He had been 38 in '88. He had been a chief warrant officer of 19 years' service. He had been a competent, methodical, evidence-based Coast Guard officer whose job was to convert an outdated manned light on an isolated headland into a modern automated station. He had come out for 3 weeks with a crew of engineers and had done the work and had run the tests and had signed the paperwork. He had, on the reckoning of a Coast Guard officer of 19 years, not been in the business of asking what a light was for. He had said, "Wendell, we're doing this the right way." I've read the operational history. Point Rey Light was constructed in 1893 for the outer coast lumber trade. When that trade shifted to Puget Sound in the 20s, the light stayed on as a matter of general marine safety. When the fishing fleet decommissioned out of Nia Bay in the 60s, there was talk of closing the station. Instead, we kept it manned. Now, we're automating. It's the next step. Wendell had said, "Chief Halstead, the light is not for the ships." Merwin had said, "What is it for, Wendell?" Wendell had looked out over the Pacific. He had said, "It's for the water." Merwin had said, "The water." Wendell had said, "There's something in the water off Point Rey. It has been there since before the light." The men who built the light in '93 knew about it. They built the light for it. The pattern of the light, the timing, the rhythm, 1 second on, 7 seconds off, 1 second on, 7 seconds off, that's not a maritime signal. That's a rhythm. The rhythm keeps the thing calm. If the light goes out, if the rhythm breaks, the thing gets restless. Merwin had looked at Wendell for a long time. Wendell had been 51 and had been on the light for 17 years. He had been, on the look of him, entirely serious. Merwin had said, Wendell had said, "I know how this sounds, Chief." Merwin had said, "You've been out here a long time." Wendell had said, 17 years. Merwin had said, "That's a lot of time alone." Wendell had said, "Yes, sir, it is." Merwin had said, "Wendell, the automation runs the same pattern the keeper ran. 1 second on, 7 seconds off. That's the pattern we programmed. That's the pattern the tower has had since the electrification in 1952. Wendell had said, "I know that, Chief." Merwin had said, "So the pattern will continue. If your theory is correct, the light will keep doing what it needs to do." Wendell had said, "The pattern is not the only thing." Merwin had said, "What else?" Wendell had said, "There's a passage that has to be read every night at midnight from the top of the tower, aloud, facing west. It's in a journal in the keeper's quarters. I have been reading it every night for 17 years. The keepers before me read it since 1894. That's what the tower is for." Merwin had looked at Wendell. He had said, "A passage from a journal." Wendell had said, "Yes, sir," Merwin had said. "Read aloud every night at midnight." Wendell had said, "Yes, sir," Merwin had said, "facing west." Wendell had said, "Yes, sir," Merwin had said, "Wendell, that's not going to be part of the automation." Wendell had said, "I know it isn't." Merwin had said, "The automation will run the light. The Coast Guard does not have the manpower or the mandate to send someone out here every night to read a passage from a journal." Wendell had said, "I know that, sir." Merwin had said, "So what are you telling me?" Wendell had said, "I am telling you what the light is for. I am telling you what I have been doing for 17 years. What the keepers before me were doing for 70 years. I am telling you because you are the one turning it off." Merwin had said, "I am not turning the light off, Wendell. I am automating it." Wendell had said, "You are turning off the part of the light that matters. And I want you to know it, so that when it starts to fail, and it will fail, Chief, in some way, and it may take 20 years or 30 or 40, but it will fail. I want you to remember that I told you." Merwin had stood at the top of the Point Rey Tower on that October afternoon in 1988 and had looked at Wendell Grieve for a long time. Then he had said, "All right, Wendell, I hear you." Wendell had said, "Thank you, Chief." They had gone back down the tower. The next day, Wendell had left with the extraction crew. Merwin had signed the paperwork. The Point Ray light had gone automated on the 10th of October, 1988. Merwin had gone back to Sector Puget Sound and had filed his report and had recommended commendation for Wendell Grieve's 17 years of service. He had not put the conversation at the top of the tower in his report. He had, on the reckoning of a chief warrant officer of 19 years, judged that the conversation was the private grief of a man losing the vocation of his life. In 1991, he had read in the Peninsula Daily News that Wendell Grieve had died in Nia Bay of a heart event at 68. He had gone to the funeral. There had been 11 people there. Wendell had never married. His nearest relative was a niece who had come up from Portland. Merwin had shaken the niece's hand. He had said, "Your uncle served this country for 37 years. The niece had said, "Thank you." They had buried Wendell in the Nia Bay Cemetery. Merwin had driven back to Port Angeles. That had been 35 years ago. He had, in the 35 years, thought about the conversation at the top of the tower maybe 4 times. Once when he had heard about Wendell's death. Once at his own retirement in 2002. Once when his wife Merle had died in 2022. And he had been going through her papers and had found a letter she had written but never sent, thanking him for the Coast Guard years. And once, sometime in 2024, when he had been reading a book about lighthouses in the Puget Sound Library. Now it was 2026, and Lieutenant Ockery had told him that the Point Ray light had been going dark for 11 months. Merwin stood in his kitchen with his hand on the receiver. He thought about it. Then he went to his hall closet. He got out his overnight bag. He packed it. He drove out the next morning at 6. Port Angeles to Nia Bay was about 75 miles by way of Highway 112. Nia Bay to Point Ray was another 11 miles along a road that had, in the last decade, become a passable gravel track thanks to the Mecca tribal maintenance crews. The final quarter mile down the headland to the tower was a footpath. Merwin drove the highway in the gray of the coastal morning. The strait was on his right. The Olympic foothills were on his left. He had driven this stretch of highway many times over his years at Sector Puget Sound. He knew the road. He got to Nia Bay at 9:10. He got a coffee at the small cafe by the marina. He drove the 11 miles out to the trailhead. He parked in the gravel lot at the top of the headland. The Coast Guard truck was already there. 2 men in Coast Guard fatigues were standing beside it. Lieutenant Vance Ockery, who Merwin had spoken to on the phone, and a petty officer whose name was Kellen Vassar. Vance was maybe 34. Petty Officer Vassar was maybe 26. Vance said, "Chief Halstead, thank you for coming." Merwin said, "Lieutenant." They shook hands. Vance said, "The tower is a quarter mile down the path. It's a fairly steep grade. Are you all right on foot?" Merwin said, "I'm all right." They walked down the path together. Kellen carried a hard case with tools. Vance carried a clipboard. The path came out of the fir and hemlock forest at the head of the point. Point Ray was a narrow rock headland extending about 300 yards into the Pacific. The tower stood at the tip. Beyond the tower there was nothing but water. The Pacific stretched to the horizon. The tower was white, 68 feet tall, concrete masonry. Built in 1893, a red band around the top. The lantern room glazed with the Fresnel lens that had been installed in 1942. Beside the tower, At the base was the one-story keeper's quarters that had been Wendell Greaves' home for 17 years and had been Wendell's predecessor's home for 68 years before that. The quarters were locked. The windows were shuttered. Vance said, "It's a hell of a spot." Merwin said, "It is." They walked to the tower. Vance unlocked the door. They went in. The interior of the tower was cool and dry. The spiral iron stairs went up 60 feet. Merwin looked up. He had climbed those stairs maybe 40 times in 1988. He had not been up them since. He said, "Let me look at the equipment first." Vance said, "Yes, sir." They walked to the small control shed adjacent to the tower. The shed had been added in 1988 as part of the automation. It contained the generator, the battery bank, the control panel, the timing controller. Merwin looked at each of them in turn. The generator was in good order. The batteries were in good order. The control panel had been updated in 2018, a different model from the one Merwin had installed, but was operating within normal parameters. The timing controller was reading the correct pattern. 1 second on, 7 seconds off. Merwin said, "Everything checks out." Vance said, "Yes, sir, that's what we keep finding." Merwin said, "When did the failures start?" Vance said, "First recorded failure was on the 17th of November, 2025. Merwin said, "Anything happen on the 16th or 17th of November?" Vance said, "There was a storm system that came through on the 15th. Winds up to 82 at the summit anemometer. We had a routine maintenance visit scheduled for the 18th to check for storm damage. When the crew got here on the 18th, the tower was dark. They restarted the system and it came back up. That evening at just after 7 p.m., it went dark again for 4 hours. Since then, we have had about 140 documented failure events." Merwin said, "Is there a log?" Vance said, "Yes, sir, in the shed." They went into the shed. Kellen pulled a printed log from a file box. Merwin sat at the small table and looked through it. He looked at the times of the failures. He looked at the durations. He looked at the pattern. He looked for a long time. He said, "Do you see it, Lieutenant?" Vance said, "See what, sir?" Merwin said, "The failures cluster around midnight." Vance said, "Around midnight." Merwin said, "Look at this log. The failures are not random. They cluster in the 4 hours between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. About 70% of the failure events start in that 4-hour window." Vance looked at the log. He said, "I see it." Merwin said, "And look at the duration. The failures that start close to midnight are the longest. The ones that start away from midnight are the shortest." Vance said, "That is peculiar." Merwin said, "It is." He closed the logbook. He looked at Vance. He said, "Lieutenant, I'd like to look at the keeper's quarters." Vance said, "Yes, sir, I have the key." They walked to the quarters. Vance unlocked the door. Merwin went in. The quarters had been closed since October of 1988, when Wendell had left. It was a small one-story house of 3 rooms, a front sitting room, a kitchen, a bedroom in the back. The walls were tongue and groove pine. The floor was pine plank. The furniture was still there, a wood stove, a plain oak table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a rolled-up mattress, a wardrobe. Merwin stood in the front sitting room. He said, "Lieutenant, give me a few minutes." Vance said, "Yes, sir, I'll be at the shed." He went out. Merwin was alone in Wendell Greaves' house. He stood for a while in the front sitting room. Then he walked to the small bookcase in the corner. He looked at the books on the shelves. Some of them were books that had been left by the Coast Guard when the quarters were closed. Safety manuals, a Bible, a copy of Boat U.S. magazine from October 1988. Some of them were older. He pulled the older books off the shelves. He looked at them. They were the books of a man who had lived in a lighthouse on the outer coast of Washington for 17 years and had, in that time, read what a lighthouse keeper reads. A dog-eared paperback of Moby Dick. A copy of the collected poems of Robinson Jeffers. A tide table for the years 1982 through 1988. A Peterson's field guide to the birds of the Pacific coast. On the bottom shelf, at the back, was a cloth-bound journal. Merwin took it out. It was a journal about 6 inches by 9, bound in dark green cloth, worn at the corners. The look of a journal that had been in daily use for a long time. He opened it. The first page was inscribed in a hand from the late 19th century. In brown ink, this journal is the property of the Point Ray Light. It is to remain at the station in perpetuity. It is to be read from at midnight every night by the keeper, on duty from the top of the tower facing west in the direction of the water. The passage is on the page marked with a ribbon. This is the task of the keeper. The light itself is not the task. The reading is Anselm Larkspur, head keeper, Point Ray, 3 August 1894. Merwin sat down on the chair by the wood stove and read the inscription twice. Then he opened to the page marked with the ribbon. The ribbon was a narrow red silk ribbon, faded to pink, sewn into the binding. It marked the page. On the page was a passage in a hand from the late 19th century. Below it, in later hands, in other inks, were dated entries, the handwriting of every keeper who had come after Anselm Larkspur, initialing that they had read the passage that night. The initials went from 1894 forward. Merwin looked at the dates. The last entry in the journal was dated 9 October 1988. It was in Wendell Greaves' handwriting. It said, W.G. Read final night of manned station. The reading has been done from this tower for 94 years. May the light hold. There were no entries after that. Merwin looked at the passage on the page. It was a passage of about 400 words, in language that was old and formal, and to what it was, a quiet address to a thing in the water off Point Ray. Not begging, not commanding, a respectful address to something old and patient that the keepers had known was there and had been keeping company with for 94 years, by way of a nightly reading, a rhythm of light, a presence at the top of a tower. Merwin read the passage twice. He closed the journal. He sat in the chair by the wood stove in the keeper's quarters of the Point Ray Light for a long time. He was thinking about Wendell Greaves. He was thinking about the conversation at the top of the tower in October of 1988. He was thinking about the 11 months of the light's failures, clustering around midnight, and about the storm on the 15th of November, 2025, and about what a storm might have done to a thing in the water off Point Ray that had been kept calm by a rhythm and a reading for 132 years. He was thinking that Wendell had been right. He was also thinking about his own life. He was 64. He had been a Coast Guard officer for 33 years and had been retired for 24. His wife Merle had been dead 4 years. They had not had children. He had, since Merle's death, been living alone in the house on Cherry Hill Lane in Port Angeles. He had been drinking too much coffee, doing too many crosswords, and thinking too often about how the years had turned out, and about how much of them had been the Coast Guard, and how little of them had been anything else. He was, in the way of a man of 64 who had come to the stretch of years in which the future was shorter than the past, in need of something. He looked at the journal in his lap. He walked out to the shed. Vance and Kellen were sitting at the small table. Vance looked up. He said, "Chief, did you find anything?" Merwin said, "Lieutenant, I have a proposal for you." Vance said, "Yes, sir," Merwin said. I would like to come out here for a period of time. Let's say 2 weeks, initially. I would like to be at the tower every night at midnight. I would like to read a passage from a journal aloud from the top of the tower, facing west. I would like to log the light's performance during those 2 weeks. Vance looked at him. Vance said, "Chief." Merwin said, "Yes, Lieutenant." Vance said, "This is what Wendell Grieve told you in 1988. Merwin said, "Yes." Vance was quiet for a moment. He said, "You didn't put it in your report." Merwin said, "No, Lieutenant, I did not." Vance said, "Chief, if I read the Coast Guard technical manual on the Point Ray light, the reading of a journal from the top of the tower will not be in it." Merwin said, "No, it will not." Vance said, "But you would like to do it." Merwin said, "Yes." Vance was quiet again. He said, "For 2 weeks." Merwin said, "Initially." Vance said, "And then." Merwin said, "And then we look at the log and see if the light stops going out." Vance was quiet for a longer moment. He said, "Chief, if the light stops going out during those 2 weeks, what would you propose we do?" Merwin said, "I would propose you allow me to keep coming out here every night, for as long as I am able." Vance said, "As an unpaid keeper." Merwin said, "Yes," Vance said. "Chief, that is not something the Coast Guard does anymore." Merwin said, "I know it isn't." Vance said, "But you would like to do it." Merwin said, "I would." Vance looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Chief, I am going to have to make some calls." Merwin said, "I would appreciate that." Vance said, "But I will tell you now that if you can show me a log of 2 weeks with no failures at Point Ray, and you have a reasonable explanation of what you did to achieve that log, I will find a way to keep you coming out here." Merwin said, "Thank you, Lieutenant," Vance said. "Chief," Merwin said. "Yes," Vance said. "Why?" Merwin looked at Vance. He said, "Because Wendell told me in 1988, and I didn't listen. And now the light is failing, and I have 35 years to make up for. And I am 64, and I am alone in Port Angeles, and I need work. I would like the work to be this." Vance nodded slowly. He said, "I understand, sir," Merwin said. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He moved into the keeper's quarters on the 4th of October, 2026. Vance and Kellen helped him bring in supplies. A propane heater, a 2-week supply of food, a new mattress for the bed frame, a satellite phone for emergency contact, a solar-charged lantern for the quarters at night. On the first night, at 11:45, Merwin walked out of the quarters and to the base of the tower. He unlocked the door. He climbed the iron spiral stairs to the lantern room. At the top, he set his lantern on the floor. He opened the journal. He looked out through the glazing at the Pacific. The Pacific was dark. The first quarter moon was low on the horizon to the west. The 1-second flash of the light came on at 11:52, and again at midnight sharp -7 seconds, and again at midnight sharp -15 seconds, and Merwin waited for midnight. At midnight he faced west. He read the passage aloud. His voice was an old man's voice, dry and careful, in the way of a man who had spent a lifetime giving orders and reports to younger officers, and who had now come to read a passage aloud from a journal in a lantern room at the top of a lighthouse on the outer coast of Washington, in October of 2026. He read the 400 words in a slow, measured way. The light went 1 second on, 7 seconds off, 1 second on, 7 seconds off. When he finished the passage, he closed the journal. He said, out loud, in a voice that was his own but that felt older, "That's the reading. That was for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow at the same time." He waited for a moment. He looked out at the Pacific. He felt, in a way, something in the water off Point Ray settle. He did not know what to name it. He did not have Wendell's 17 years of patience with it. but he felt it. In the quiet way of a thing that had been restless for 11 months, and had, on the occasion of a reading from a lantern room, come to a rest. Merwin stood at the top of the tower for a while. Then he went back down. He walked to the quarters. He sat in the chair by the wood stove. He wrote in the journal, below Wendell's last entry from 9 October 1988, MH. Read. 2-week trial begins. The rhythm is restored. Merwin Halstead, retired Q UCG, 4 October 2026. He closed the journal. He sat by the wood stove for a while. He thought about Wendell. He said out loud, in the quiet way of a man of 64 alone in a lighthouse keeper's quarters on the outer coast of Washington, "Wendell, I heard you. I'm sorry it took 38 years. The quarters were quiet." But he felt, in the way, that Wendell would have understood. Merwin banked the fire in the wood stove. He went to bed. He slept the deep sleep of a man of 64 who had, for the first time in 4 years, done work that mattered. The 2 weeks passed. Merwin read the passage every night at midnight. He logged the light. It did not go out once. At the end of the 2 weeks, Vance came out with a Coast Guard truck. Merwin gave him the log. Vance looked at it. Vance said, "Chief." Merwin said, "Yes, Lieutenant," Vance said. "I have spoken with my captain. And my captain has spoken with the district commander. And the district commander is a man named Rear Admiral Roland Sederholm, who was, in his career, stationed for 2 years at the Puget Sound light stations under old regulations. He remembers the Point Rey station." Merwin said, "Sederholm?" Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "I served with his father in Kodiak in the 70s. Vance said, "He knows, sir. He remembers your name." Merwin said, "What did the Rear Admiral say?" Vance said, "The Rear Admiral said, Chief, that if a retired crew wishes to volunteer his time at a Coast Guard installation for the purposes of research into the intermittent failures of the automated system, that is a matter within his authority to allow, and he allows it." Merwin said, "For how long?" Vance said, "Indefinitely, sir," the Rear Admiral said, and I quote, "until Chief Halstead determines that his research is complete." Merwin nodded. He said, "Thank you, Lieutenant." Vance said, "Chief?" Merwin said, "Yes." Vance said, "You know the Rear Admiral is not going to ask what the research consists of." Merwin said, "I know he isn't." Vance said, "And you know I am not going to ask either." Merwin said, "I know you aren't." Vance said, "Good." Merwin said, "Lieutenant?" Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "I have one more request." Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "There will need to be a successor. Someone I train. Someone who takes over when I am no longer able." Vance said, "You mean when you die, sir?" Merwin said, "I do." Vance was quiet for a moment. Then Vance said, "Chief, I am 34. I have 26 years left in the Coast Guard. When I retire, I will be 60. I would like to be the successor." Merwin looked at Vance. He said, "Lieutenant," Vance said, "I have been reading about the Point Rey light for 11 months, Chief. I have been trying to figure out what is going on out here. I have come to some conclusions of my own. I would like to learn from you." Merwin said, "It is not a small commitment." Vance said, "I know it isn't." Merwin said, "You would come out here every night." Vance said, "When I retire, yes," Merwin said, "every night. In every weather." Alone, Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "It is a loneliness." Vance said, "I know, sir." Merwin looked at Vance for a long time. Then he said, "All right, Lieutenant. When you are ready, I will train you." Vance said, "Thank you, sir," Merwin said. In the meantime, you can come out here on your leave weekends. Learn the reading. Learn the rhythm. Meet the thing in the water. It will need to know you over time. Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "It has been here a long time, Lieutenant. Longer than the Lighthouse. Longer than the country. Longer than the macaw. And the macaw have been here 12,000 years. It is old, and it is patient. It has come to expect the rhythm of a reading at midnight from the top of the tower. It has come to accept that as its rhythm. It is not evil. It is not good. It is old, and it is patient, and it wants the rhythm. And we are the ones who give it the rhythm. Since 1894, that is what the light is for." Vance said, "Yes, sir." Merwin said, "All right, Lieutenant, go home. Come back on your next leave." Vance said, "Yes, sir." They shook hands. Vance and Kellen packed up the truck. They drove up the Trailhead Road toward Nia Bay. Merwin walked back down the path to the quarters. He stood on the porch of the keeper's quarters at the base of the Point Ray Light on the 18th of October, 2026, and he looked out over the Pacific. The late afternoon light was on the water. The gulls were calling. The rhythm of the 1-second flash was going. 1 second on, 7 seconds off. The pulse of the light he had automated in 1988 and had come back to in 2026 to complete. He had, in the quiet way, come home, not to his house in Port Angeles. To this, the keeper's quarters, the tower, the reading, the thing in the water that he could not see but could feel, and that he was going to keep company with for as long as he was able. For Wendell, for himself, for the thing in the water, for the rhythm that had gone unbroken from 1894 to 1988 and had, on his watch, gone broken for 38 years and was now, on his watch, restored. He walked into the quarters. He made himself a cup of coffee at the wood stove. He sat in the chair by the window. He was Merwin Halstead. He was 64. He was the new keeper of the Point Ray Light. That was the work. He was going to do it well. Rhett Corbell had been a commercial saturation diver for 11 years. And on the 14th of March 2026, at 11:52 in the morning, he entered the moon pool of the diving support vessel Halloran, on charter to Chevron, for structural inspection of the West Delta 118 platform in the Gulf of Mexico, 47 miles southwest of Cameron, Louisiana, at a working depth of 340 feet. He was 34 years old. He was 6 feet tall. He weighed 181 pounds. He had brown hair and gray eyes and a small scar on his upper lip from a fight in Baton Rouge when he had been 19. He had a wife of 8 years named Cara and a daughter of 6 named June. And he had a house in Lake Charles that had a mortgage of $180,000 and a Ford F-250 that was paid off and a savings account with about $93,000 in it. He had done, over the 11 years, about 800 saturation dives. He was one of the good ones. On the reckoning of the industry, he was a hire that got called back. He had worked for Cal Dive International in the Gulf, for Subsea 7 off the coast of Brazil, for Bibby offshore in the North Sea. He had been on the Halloran for 14 months, on a contract with the operator. At 11:52 on the 14th of March, he was in the moon pool, in the diving bell, at the surface, ready for descent. The bell was a 12-foot steel sphere with a lower hatch. It could carry 2 divers and a bellman. On this dive, it was carrying Rhett and his dive partner, Halsey Dever, 38, of Morgan City, and their bellman Ivor Vaus, 51, of Broussard. Rhett was in his hot water suit. He was breathing heliox at the saturation mix for 340 feet. He had his umbilical clipped. He had his helmet checked. He had done, over 11 years, this pre-dive checklist maybe 800 times. Ivor said over the comm, "Bell ready." The dive supervisor on the Halloran, a man named Palmer Ives, who had been running dives for Chevron for 22 years, said, "Roger, Bell ready. Descent when you are." Ivor said, "Descending." The bell went down through the moon pool. The bell went into the Gulf water. Rhett watched through the small port. He saw the blue of the shallow water. He saw the fade of blue to darker blue as they went down. He saw the pass of a school of small, silvery fish at about 50 feet. He was calm. He had been on 800 dives. He was the one who was calm on the bell descent. Halsey was one of the good ones, too, but Halsey talked on descent. Halsey was talking now, on the comm, about a boat he was thinking about buying, a 22-foot Boston whaler that a friend of his was selling in Bell shafts. Halsey talked about the boat for the whole descent. Rhett listened. Rhett said, "Uh-huh," a few times. Rhett watched through the port. At 340 feet, Ivor stopped the bell. They were at working depth. Rhett looked at his gauges. He looked at his umbilical. He looked at his helmet lock. He looked at Halsey. Halsey said, "You go first." Rhett said, "I'll go first." He opened the lower hatch. He went down through the trunk. The water came up around him. The heliox in his helmet held. He kicked away from the bell. He was in the water. He looked up. The bell was above him. The umbilical trailed up from his helmet to the bell to the surface. Halsey's shape was visible through the port. Halsey gave him a thumbs up. Rhett gave a thumbs up back. He turned. He swam toward the platform. The West Delta 118 was a fixed steel jacket in 340 feet of water. Forelegs. Braced. It had been on station since 1979. It was scheduled for decommissioning in 2030. Rhett was on the dive to inspect a structural weld at the intersection of the northeast leg and one of the horizontal braces at the minus 330-foot level. He got to the weld. He put his hand on it. He shone his helmet lamp on it. The weld was, on the look of it, sound. He ran his hand along it. He felt for cracks. He felt for pitting. He felt for what he had been sent down to feel for. He said over the comm, "Palmer weld is at least visually sound." Running the UT now. Palmer said, "Roger, UT." Rhett unclipped the ultrasonic thickness gauge from his belt. He ran the probe along the weld. He watched the readout on the small display on his forearm. The weld showed the correct thickness. He ran the probe along it 3 times. 3 good runs. He noted the readings. He said, "Palmer, UT is clean." Weld at 318 millimeters at the thinnest. Averaged 346 across the run. Well within tolerance. Palmer said, "Roger, Rhett, move on to the brace joint." Rhett said, moving to the brace joint. He swam along the horizontal brace toward the joint at the vertical center of the jacket. That was when he saw it. He was swimming with his helmet lamp pointed forward. The lamp was throwing a cone of light out about 8 feet into the dark water. Beyond the cone there was nothing. There was the black of the Gulf at 340 feet, which was the black of a closed room. The water was warmer than a diver would expect at that depth. The Gulf was that way. The deep water at the platform was maybe 52 degrees, but it was the dark of a place with no light except what the diver brought with him. Rhett was swimming forward. He looked to his left. There was something in the water beside him. He stopped. He held his position. He turned his head slowly to the left. The thing was about 12 feet to his left. It was at his depth. It was, on the look of it, a shape in the water. Not a fish. Not the outline of a piece of the platform structure. Not a piece of debris. It was a shape. It was about the size and shape of a man. It was hanging in the water at his depth, at his lateral distance, not moving. Rhett looked at it. His helmet lamp did not reach it. The lamp threw its cone forward. To the left, at 12 feet, the cone did not reach. The shape was in the dark, just past the edge of the cone. But he could see it. He could see it in the way a diver sees things at working depth. Not by the light of his own lamp, but by the slight illumination that came from behind him. The glow of Halsey's helmet lamp, moving somewhere behind him and above him, and the ambient bioluminescence of the water, and the reflection of light off the pale surfaces of the platform structure. By that compound light, the shape was visible. It was hanging in the water. It was looking at him. Rhett did not, on the reckoning of a saturation diver of 11 years, panic. He had been trained not to panic. He had, on 800 dives, seen things at depth that had not been what a diver would want to see. An 8-foot bull shark that had come close on a dive in the North Sea. A tangle of fishing net that had wrapped his umbilical off Brazil. A bloom of jellyfish that had lit up around him at 200 feet in the Gulf and had glowed like a field of stars. He had, on all those occasions, not panicked. He did not panic now. But his heart went in his chest, in the way a diver's heart goes when something is not right. He said, over the comm, in a slow, calm voice, Palmer said, "Go, Rhett." Rhett said, "I have." Something in the water off my port side. About 12 feet. My depth. Not moving. Palmer said, "What is it?" Rhett said, "Palmer, I do not know." Palmer said, "Is it a fish?" Rhett said, "Not a fish." Palmer said, "Is it a jelly?" Rhett said, "Not a jelly." Palmer said, "Is it a piece of debris?" Rhett said, "Not on the look, Palmer. It is. It looks like the shape of a man." There was a moment of silence on the comm. Palmer said, "Is it Halsey?" Rhett said, "Halsey is behind me. I can see his lamp behind me. This is off my port. Halsey is 15 feet aft." Palmer said, "Halsey, confirm your position." Halsey said, "Palmer, I am at the brace joint working the inspection. Rhett is off to my 1 o'clock, about 10 feet. Palmer said, "So Rhett has a contact off his port." Halsey said, "Rhett, you got a diver in the water we don't know about." Rhett said, "Halsey, it is not a diver." Halsey said, "What do you mean?" Rhett said, "It is not a diver. It does not have a helmet. It does not have an umbilical." Palmer said, "Rhett, are you telling me you have a naked human body in the water at 340 feet? Rhett said, "Palmer, it is not a naked human body. It is the shape of a man. It does not have arms. It has the outline of arms. It does not have hands. It does not have a face. It has the outline of a face." Palmer was quiet. Palmer said, "Rhett, talk me through what you are seeing." Rhett said, "Palmer, I am seeing a shape in the water at my depth, about 12 feet off my port beam. The shape is about 6 feet tall. It is oriented upright. It is not swimming. It is not moving in the current. It is hanging in the water. It has the outline of a head, a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs. But it does not have surface. It is, Palmer. It is like looking at a place where a man is not. It is like the water is missing a man-shaped piece." Palmer said, "The water is missing a man-shaped piece." Rhett said, "That is what it looks like." Palmer said, "Rhett, I want you to slowly, calmly, hold your position. Do not swim toward it. Do not swim away from it. Do you have a video feed running?" Rhett said, "The helmet camera is running." Palmer said, Turn slowly to your port and let the helmet camera see it. Rhett said, Palmer, I am going to turn to my port. He turned slowly. The helmet lamp swept to the left. The cone of the lamp reached the shape. The lamp did not illuminate it. Rhett stopped turning. He was, on the reckoning, now facing the shape directly. The cone of his helmet lamp was pointed at it. The lamp was throwing about 700 lumens forward at a depth where there was nothing to absorb the light and nothing to reflect it back, except what was in the cone. The shape was in the cone. It was not illuminated. The lamp was hitting where the shape was. The light was not stopping at the shape, and it was not passing around the shape. The light was going into the shape and not coming back. The shape was standing in his helmet lamp like a hole cut out of the water. Rhett said, Palmer. Palmer said, Rhett said, Palmer. The lamp is not illuminating it. The lamp is going into it and not coming back. Palmer said, Rhett, I am seeing that on the video feed. Rhett said, Palmer, are you seeing what I am seeing? Palmer said, Rhett, I am seeing a man-shaped absence in the water at 12 feet off your port beam that the helmet lamp is not illuminating. Yes, I am seeing that. Halsey said, over the comm. What? Rhett, what Palmer said. Halsey, hold at the brace joint. Halsey said, Palmer, I am coming up to Rhett. Palmer said, Halsey, do not. Hold at the brace joint. Halsey said, Palmer, my partner has a contact. Palmer said, Halsey, hold at the brace joint. I do not want two divers in one location. Hold, Halsey said. Copy, holding. Palmer said, Rhett, I want you to slowly, calmly back away from the contact. Kick backwards. Do not turn around. Do not take your eyes off it. Slowly, Rhett said, Palmer, I am kicking backwards. He kicked backwards. He watched the shape. The shape did not move. He kicked backwards. He counted. 1 kick, 2 kicks, 3 kicks, 4 kicks. He was moving backwards at about a foot per kick. He was, on the reckoning, opening the distance between him and the shape. The shape stayed at 12 feet from him. Rhett stopped kicking. He said, Palmer. Palmer said, Rhett said, Palmer, it is moving with me. Palmer said, say again. Rhett said, it is moving with me. I have kicked backwards about 4 feet. The shape is still 12 feet off my port beam. It has moved with me. Palmer said quietly, copy. Palmer said, Rhett, kick backwards. Do not stop. Rhett said, kicking. He kicked backwards for about a minute. He kept his eyes on the shape. The shape kept pace with him. It did not move as a swimming man moves. It did not move as a fish moves. It did not appear to move at all. The man-shaped absence was in the same position relative to him. He was moving. The absence was moving with him. Rhett said, Palmer. Palmer said, Rhett, continue. Rhett said, Palmer, it is with me. Palmer said, Rhett, go to the bell. Now, Rhett said, kicking to the bell. He turned. He kicked toward the bell. He was about 20 feet from the bell. He kicked. He watched the bell. He did not look at the shape. He knew it was there. He got to the trunk. He got to the lower hatch. He went up through the trunk. He was in the bell. Ivor was at the hatch. Ivor looked at him. Ivor said, Rhett said, close the hatch. Ivor closed the hatch. Rhett was in the bell. He was in his hot water suit. His umbilical was clipped. His helmet was on. His breathing was fast. Ivor was watching him. Palmer was on the comm. Halsey was on the comm. Palmer said, Rhett, talk to me. Rhett said, Palmer, I am in the bell. Halsey is at the brace joint. Bring Halsey up. Palmer said, Halsey, come to the bell. Halsey said, coming to the bell. Halsey came up through the trunk about a minute later. Ivor closed the hatch behind him. Halsey looked at Rhett. Halsey looked at Ivor. Halsey said, what the hell was that? Rhett said, I don't know. Palmer said, Bell, come up. Ivor said, "Coming up." Ivor operated the bell winch. The bell began to rise. Rhett sat on the small bench inside the bell. He looked out the port. The shape was outside the port. He saw it. It was in the water. It was at the same distance from the bell that it had been from him. It was outside the port. It was, on the reckoning, coming up with him. Rhett said, Palmer said, Rhett said, "It is outside the port." There was a pause. Palmer said, "Rhett, say again." Rhett said, "The shape is outside the bell port. It is coming up with us." Halsey said, "Rhett, there is nothing outside the port." Rhett looked at Halsey. Halsey was at the port. Halsey was looking out. Halsey said, "There is nothing out there." Rhett said, "It is right there." Halsey said, "Rhett, there is nothing out there." Rhett stood up. He went to the port. He looked out. The shape was there. He said to Halsey, in a voice that was calm because he had been trained to be calm, "Halsey, are you seeing what I am seeing?" Halsey said, "Rhett, I am seeing the water outside the port." "That's it." Rhett said, "You do not see the shape." Halsey said, "No, Rhett, I do not see any shape." Palmer said on the comm, "Rhett, the helmet camera is stowed. I do not have a video feed on the bell exterior. I cannot confirm or deny." Rhett said, "Palmer, it is right there." Halsey put his hand on Rhett's shoulder. Halsey said, "Rhett, come sit down." Rhett sat down. He kept looking out the port. The shape was there. The bell came up. Rhett watched the shape. It came up with him the whole way. Past 200 feet. Past 150 feet. Past 100 feet. Past 50. At about 30 feet, the water was bright enough that the shape was harder to see. At about 20 feet, Rhett could not see it anymore. The bell surfaced in the moon pool. The crew opened the hatch. Rhett got out. The daylight was on the Gulf. The gray March afternoon was over the deck of the Halloran. The gulls were on the mast. The yellow lights of the platform were visible in the distance. Rhett went into decompression. He was in decompression for 6 days. In the decompression chamber, he did not speak much. He talked to his wife on the phone once a day for the 6 days. He said he was fine. He said the dive had gone well. He did not tell her about the shape. On the 6th day, he came out of decompression. He signed the logs. He was choppered off the Halloran to Cameron. He was driven from Cameron to Lake Charles. He got home. His wife Cora was at the door. His daughter June was at the door. He hugged them both. Cora said, "Rhett, are you all right?" Rhett said, "I'm all right." Cora said, "You look." Rhett said, "I'm all right. I'm home." He was home. That evening, he sat on the couch with June. He watched the movie with her. It was an animated movie about a girl and a horse. June sat under his arm. She fell asleep. He carried her to bed. He came back to the living room. Cora was there. He said, "Cora," she said, "Yes." He said, "I am not going to dive anymore." She looked at him. She said, "Rhett," he said, "I am going to finish my contract with the operator. That's 2 more months, and then I am done. I am not going to renew. I am going to look for work onshore." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Something happened." He said, "Something happened." She said, "Are you going to tell me?" He said, "I don't think I am. I don't think I can. It would not be what a diver's wife should hear. I saw something. It saw me. I don't know what it was. I am not going to see it again." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "All right, Rhett." He said, "All right." She said, "Come to bed." He came to bed. He slept. He finished the 2 months on the Halloran. He did not do any more dives. He worked topside as a supervisor. He signed off on his last shift on the 17th of May, 2026. He came home. He got a job with a offshore services company in Lake Charles, doing dive operations planning. He worked at a desk. He drove home every night. He was there for supper. He put his daughter to bed. He slept. He did not, in the years that followed, tell anyone about the shape. He did not tell Cora. He did not tell Halsey when Halsey called him on his birthday. He did not tell Palmer when Palmer called him from the Halloran 2 years later to ask if he wanted to come back. He did not tell anyone. He was on the reckoning of a man who had seen something at 340 feet in the Gulf of Mexico that no one else had seen, alone with it. But he was on land. He was with his family. He was sleeping in his own bed at night. And he was not diving. At night sometimes, when he could not sleep, he thought about the shape. He thought about the way it had looked at him from 12 feet off his port beam. He thought about the way it had moved with him. He thought about the way it had come up with the bell. He thought about the way Halsey had not seen it. He thought about the way it had been at the port until about 20 feet from the surface. He thought about whether it had come up the rest of the way, whether it was still in the water, whether it was still at the platform, whether it was still somewhere in the Gulf, hanging at 340 feet, waiting for the next diver to come down. He thought about that. But he was not going to be that diver. He had his desk job. He had his wife. He had his daughter. He was home. He was going to stay home. And on the nights he could not sleep, he would get up quietly and go to the window and look out at the Louisiana night, the glow of Lake Charles in the sky, the hum of the highway, the cricket sound in the grass, and he would think about the shape, and then he would go back to bed, and he would sleep, because the shape was in the Gulf, and he was in Lake Charles, and that was the distance he was going to keep for the rest of his life. Elsbeth Yarrow had been a senior estate sale coordinator for the firm of Prendergast and Loyal of Providence, Rhode Island, for 11 years. And on the second Wednesday of October 2026, she was clearing the residence of a woman named Mira Olestad, who had died at the age of 91 in a house on Waterman Street on the east side. The house was a 3-story wood frame from 1896, with a mansard roof and a slate walk to the front steps. Mira had lived there for 64 years. She and her husband, Gustav Olestad, had bought it in 1962, and she had lived there alone since Gustav's death in 2009. She had no children. The estate was going to a nephew in Chicago named Renard Yates, who had power of attorney and had contracted Prendergast and Loyal to inventory and disperse the contents. Elsbeth got to the house at 8 in the morning. Her associate, a young man named Patrick Vandry, who had been with the firm 11 months, met her at the front step. They went in. The house was, on the inside, quiet in the way houses are quiet after a life. The furniture was still where it had been. A grandfather clock in the front hall was still keeping time. A pair of reading glasses was still on a small side table beside a wing chair in the parlor. A cup was in the kitchen sink. Mira had been found in the parlor on the 18th of September by her cleaning woman, a woman named Delphine Wark, and had been taken to the funeral home in Cranston, and the house had been closed up since. Elsbeth had done maybe 300 such houses over her 11 years. She knew what to do. She said to Patrick, "We start with the top floor, bedrooms and the attic. We work down. First pass, we photograph and log. Second pass, we sort. Third pass, we tag. You take a floor, and I take a floor. Meet me on the second floor at 10. Patrick said, "Yes, ma'am." He went up. Elsbeth started on the third floor. The third floor had 2 bedrooms and a small storage room. She logged the bedrooms: a bed frame, a chest of drawers, a wardrobe, a small writing desk, a collection of hardcover books in the way of a woman who had bought books in the 60s and 70s and had kept them. She logged the storage room: Christmas ornaments in cardboard boxes, a set of luggage from the 50s, a stack of Life magazines from the 60s, a rocking horse from what looked like the 20s. She went to the attic. The attic ran the length of the house. It had a peaked ceiling and dormer windows on both sides. The floor was pine plank. The dust in the air was the dust of a Rhode Island attic in October, dry, floating in the angled light coming through the west dormers. Along the west wall was a stack of steamer trunks. Along the south wall was an old sewing machine on a cabinet. Along the north wall was a pile of what looked, on first look, like film cans. Elsbeth walked over. The film cans were metal, round, about 8 inches across. Silver, mostly. Some of them were labeled with masking tape and small strips of paper in handwriting. She counted them. 12 cans. She picked one up. The label read, "In a hand from the 60s, 1964. Cape Cod, Og, also Deirdre's birthday, Sep." She set it down. She picked up another. 1965. Thanksgiving, also New Year's Eve. She looked at all 12. They were labeled by year, from 1962 to 1968. Home movies, 8mm on the size of the cans. She noted them in her log. She wrote 12 8mm home movie reels, labeled 1962-1968, to be evaluated for archival value, possible interest to family. Then she thought about Renard Yates. Renard was the nephew in Chicago. He was in his 60s. He was the son of Mira's sister Ilse, who had died in 1994. Elsbeth had spoken to Renard on the phone 3 times about the estate. He had told her, on the first call, that he did not want any of Mira's belongings. He wanted the house sold, the contents dispersed, the proceeds sent to him. He had said he had barely known his Aunt Mira. He had said his mother and his aunt had been estranged since the 60s. Elsbeth thought that the home movies might be worth flagging for him anyway. Home movies were, in the reckoning, a kind of family object. Even a person who did not want the furniture might want the home movies. She marked the cans as hold for family review. She went downstairs. On the second floor, she met Petrick at 10. They compared notes. She logged the parlor. Petrick took the kitchen. They worked through the afternoon. At 3 in the afternoon, Elsbeth called Renard Yates in Chicago. She said, "Mr. Yates. This is Elsbeth Yarrow at Prendergast and Loyal. I'm calling to update you on the estate." Renard said, "Yes, thank you." She said, "I wanted to flag one item for your consideration. In the attic, there are 12 reels of 8mm home movies from the 1960s. Family footage, Cape Cod, holidays, family gatherings. They are labeled by year, 62 through 68. I wanted to ask if you would like them shipped to you, or if you would like them digitized before dispersal." There was a pause on the line. Renard said, "Home movies." Elsbeth said, "Yes, sir." Renard said, "Miss Yarrow." She said, "Yes." He said, "Please, dispose of them." She said, "Sir, they might be of interest to him." He said, "Miss Yarrow, please dispose of them. I do not want them. I do not want them digitized. I do not want them in a box in my basement. I do not want copies of them. I do not want them to exist. Please dispose of them." She said, "Yes, sir, of course. That is your call. But could I ask?" He said, "Miss Yarrow, my family had reasons for the estrangement between my mother and my aunt. Those reels are from the period my mother did not want to discuss. I do not want to discuss them either. Please dispose of them." She said, "I understand, sir." I will do so." He said thank you. He hung up. Elsbeth sat in the parlor of the house on Waterman Street at 3:17 in the afternoon on the second Wednesday of October, 2026, and she thought about the 12 reels of home movies. She was on the reckoning of a woman who had done 300 estate sales in Providence and had come to know the way people spoke about the belongings of the dead, aware that Leonard Yates had spoken about the home movies in a way that was not the way people ordinarily spoke about home movies. He had not been indifferent. He had been actively opposed to them. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that Leonard's mother and Mira had been estranged since the 60s, that the estrangement had happened in the years covered by the reels, 62 to 68. She was on the reckoning of a woman who spent her working life looking through the objects of the dead, curious about what people did not want. She went back to the attic. She got the 12 reels. She brought them down to the parlor. She put them in a box. At 6 p.m., she and Petrick locked the house. Elsbeth carried the box to her car. At home in her apartment on Angel Street, she set the box on her kitchen table. She looked at it for a while. She poured herself a glass of wine. She thought about the instructions from Leonard. Then she got out her laptop. She looked up a service that transferred ATME to digital. There was one on Broadway in Warwick that did rush jobs. She read the reviews. She called them the next morning. She drove the reels down at 10. She said she wanted them digitized to MP4, delivered on a USB drive. She said she would pay Rush. The technician, a young man named Bran Halsett, said they could have them ready by the end of the week. She said, "Bran, I want them to be a private transfer. I don't want anyone else looking at them, and I don't want you to keep a copy on your system." Bran said, "Ma'am, that's standard for us. We transfer, we deliver, we wipe. Nothing stays." She said thank you. She drove back to Providence. On Friday afternoon, Bran called her. He said the transfer was done. She could pick them up any time before 6. She drove down. She picked up the reels and the USB drive. She paid. She drove home. At her kitchen table, she plugged the USB into her laptop. She opened the first file. It was labeled 1962.mp4. The reel opened with a shot of a beach, Cape Cod, a stretch of dune grass and low surf. The camera was handheld. It panned across the beach. There was a young woman in a white one-piece bathing suit walking along the surf line with a small child, maybe 2 years old. The woman was Mira. Elspeth recognized her from the photographs in the house. Mira had been a woman of about 27 in 1962. The child was, on the reckoning, a girl child. Mira's daughter, Deirdre, who Elspeth had learned about in the initial estate documents, who had been born in 1960 and had died in 1972 at the age of 12 of a childhood cancer. Elspeth watched. The camera followed Mira and Deirdre down the beach. The film had the graininess of 8mm Kodachrome. The colors were the colors of home movies from the 60s, saturated blues and reds and yellows. Mira picked Deirdre up and held her on her hip. They walked toward the camera. At about 1 minute and 11 seconds into the film there was, in the background of the shot, a figure. Elsbeth paused the video. She rewound. She played it again at half speed. The figure was in the background, along the dune line, about 80 feet behind Mira and Deirdre. It was standing on the dune, facing the camera. Elsbeth paused on the figure. She zoomed in. The figure was hard to see. The 8mm resolution was low. The figure was small in the frame, but it was there. It was, on the look, a person of about average height. It was wearing dark clothing. It was standing on the dune ridge and facing the camera. Elsbeth looked at it for a while. She thought, probably a beach visitor, a person walking on the dune. The Cape in August was full of people. A figure on the dune was in the reckoning of a home movie from Cape Cod in August of 1962. Not unusual. She continued the video. The scene changed to a picnic. Mira, Gustav, Deirdre, and another couple were sitting at a picnic table. The other couple was, on the look of them, in their 30s. Elspeth thought maybe they were Mira's sister Ilse and Ilse's husband. She did not know for sure. The picnic went on for about 2 minutes. At about 3 minutes, 20 seconds into the film there was, in the background of the picnic shot, past the picnic table and toward the tree line, a figure. Elspeth paused. She rewound. She played at half speed. The figure was at the tree line, about 40 feet behind the picnic table. It was standing at the edge of the woods, facing the camera. She zoomed in. The figure was in dark clothing. It was of average height. It was, on the look, a person. She could not see its face. She looked at it for a while. She thought, all right, probably the same beach visitor, or a park ranger, or a person from a nearby campsite. She thought about how, in a place with a number of people, the probability of a random figure appearing in the background of 2 shots was not 0. She continued the video. The next scene was Deirdre's second birthday party, September of 1962. It looked to be in the front yard of the Waterman Street house. Deirdre in a small dress, a cake on a table, Mira and Gustav and the other couple, and a few other people around the table. At about 4 minutes, 40 seconds into the film there was, in the background of a shot of Deirdre blowing out the candle on her cake, a figure. It was standing on the sidewalk in front of the Waterman Street house, facing the camera, the same figure. Elspeth stopped the video. She sat at her kitchen table on Angel Street on the evening of Friday, the 16th of October, 2026, and she looked at the paused image on her laptop. The figure on the sidewalk was in dark clothing, of average height, standing on the brick sidewalk in front of the Waterman Street house in Providence, Rhode Island, in September of 1962. Elspeth was, on the reckoning of a woman who had been an estate sale coordinator for 11 years and had watched home movies of dead people as part of her work more than a few times, aware that the figure she was looking at was not a random passerby. She was aware of it in the quiet way of a woman who had seen a pattern and had understood that the pattern was going to continue and was going to be, on the reckoning, everywhere in the film. She opened the second file, 1963, MP4. She scrubbed through it. The figure was in the shot of Easter, in the background of the family photo on the porch of the Waterman Street house. The figure was in the shot of a July 4th barbecue, in the background of Deirdre eating a hot dog. The figure was in the shot of Christmas 1963, in the background of Deirdre opening a present, standing in the doorway between the parlor and the dining room. Facing the camera, Elspeth opened the third file, 1964, MP4. The figure was in every scene of the 64 reel, too. She opened the fourth file, 1965, MP4. Every scene, 5th, 6th, 7th, all of them. Every reel, every scene, the figure was there, in the background, facing the camera. Watching, not once did it move. Not once did anyone else in the frame appear to acknowledge it. Not once did the camera zoom in on it. Not once did anyone gesture toward it. Not once did anyone step in front of it or behind it. It was, on the reckoning of a home movie, made by a family that appeared to be entirely ordinary. An entity that was in every scene of 6 years of home movies, and that no one in the family was seeing. The last reel, 1968 MP4, was of Deirdre's 8th birthday party in September of 1968. The figure was in the background of every shot. By the 8th birthday party, the figure was closer to the family than it had been in the 62 reels. It was, in the 62 Cape Cod footage, 80 feet behind them on the dune. In the 68th birthday party footage, it was, in the parlor of the Waterman Street house, about 8 feet behind Gustav, in a corner of the room, by a tall grandfather clock that was the same grandfather clock that had been in the front hall when Elsbeth had walked through the house that Wednesday. The figure was standing in the parlor of the Waterman Street house, 8 feet from Gustav Ollestad, at Deirdre's 8th birthday party in September 1968, facing the camera. Elsbeth stopped the video. She sat at her kitchen table. She looked at the paused image on her laptop. She sat for a long time. She thought about the fact that Ilse and Mira had been estranged since the 60s. She thought about the fact that Renard Yates had said his mother did not want to discuss the period covered by the reels. She thought about the fact that Deirdre had died at the age of 12 in 1972. She thought about the fact that the reels ended in 1968, 4 years before Deirdre's death. She thought about why they had ended. She thought about the figure moving closer, year by year, toward the family. From the dune line at 80 feet, to the tree line at 40 feet, to the sidewalk in front of the house, to the doorway between the parlor and the dining room, to the corner of the parlor at 8 feet from Gustav. She thought about whether the 69 reels, if there had been 69 reels, would have shown the figure closer still. She thought about the way home movies stopped in a family. She thought about the way Deirdre had died 4 years later. She thought. She got up. She poured herself a fresh glass of wine. She sat back down. She called Renard Yates in Chicago. It was 8:42 in the evening. He picked up on the 4th ring. He said, "Yates," she said. "Mr. Yates, this is Elsbeth Yarrow at Prendergast and Loyal. I'm sorry to call after hours." He said, "Miss Yarrow, what can I do for you?" She said, "Mr. Yates, I have to apologize. I told you I would dispose of the home movies. I did not. I had them digitized. I have watched them." There was a long pause. Renard said, "I see." She said, "Mr. Yates." He said, "Miss Yarrow, what did you see?" She said, "There is a figure in every scene." He was quiet for a while. He said, "Yes," she said, "you knew." He said, "My mother told me about it in 1991, when she was dying. She said it was in every reel." She said, "Did you ever see the reels?" He said, "No, my mother told me my Aunt Mira and my Uncle Gustav had shown them the 68 reels at the Christmas gathering that year. My mother had seen the figure. My mother had asked Mira and Gustav if they saw it. They said they did not. My mother had pointed at the screen. Mira and Gustav had not seen anything on the screen except the family. My mother had left with my father that night. She never spoke to Mira again." Elspeth said, "Mr. Yates, did your mother know what it was?" He said, "She said it was a thing. She said it had been with the family. She said it had followed Mira and Gustav. She said it had killed Deirdre. She said she was sure of it." Elspeth said, "Did she ever?" Renard said, "Miss Yarrow, she was dying. She was on morphine. She was 93. I did not take it seriously at the time. I did not believe her." Elspeth said, "But you did not want the reels." Renard said, "No, I did not. I asked you to destroy them, not because I believed her, because I did not want to look. I did not want to know." Elspeth said, "Mr. Yates." Renard said, "Yes, Miss Yarrow." She said, "The figure is in every scene. It moves closer over the years. In the 68 birthday party, it is 8 feet from your Uncle Gustav, in the parlor of the house on Waterman Street." Renard was quiet. He said, "Deirdre died in 72. Elsbeth said, "Yes," Renard said, "My Uncle Gustav died in 09. Elsbeth said, "Yes," Renard said, "My Aunt Mira died last month." Elsbeth said yes. Renard said, Miss Yarrow. She said yes. He said, please destroy the reels. Please destroy the digital copies. Please destroy your USB drive. Please do not think about them anymore. She said, Mr. Yates. He said, please, Miss Yarrow, I am asking you as a favor. Please. She said, all right, Mr. Yates. He said, thank you. She said, good night, Mr. Yates. He said, good night, Miss Yarrow. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table. She looked at her laptop. She looked at the paused image of the parlor at the 88th birthday party, of the figure 8 feet from Gustav in the corner by the grandfather clock. She closed the laptop. She got up. She took the USB drive out of the port. She held it in her hand. She walked to the sink. She turned on the gas burner of her stove. She held the USB drive over the flame with a pair of kitchen tongs. She burned it. The plastic caught. The chip inside melted. She held it over the flame for a long time. She dropped the ruined USB into a bowl of water in the sink. She went to the box on her kitchen table. She got out the 12 reels of 80mm film. She thought about how to destroy 80mm film. She thought about burning it. 80mm nitrate was flammable, though these later reels were probably acetate. She thought about the smoke. She thought about her neighbors. She decided on the way she was going to do it. She took the reels out to her car. She drove to a place she knew on the shore of the Providence River near India Point Park. She parked. She got out. She walked to the water. She threw each reel, one at a time, into the river. She watched them sink. She drove home. She went to bed. She could not sleep. She got up at 3 in the morning. She sat in her small living room. She turned on a lamp. She thought about the figure. She thought about how the figure had been in the background of every scene of 6 years of a family's home movies. She thought about how the figure had moved closer over the years. She thought about how the figure had been 8 feet from Gustav in 1968. She thought about how she had watched the reels. She thought about how she had, in the watching, been the person in front of the camera for 4 hours on a Friday night in October 2026. She thought about how the figure had been in every scene facing the camera. She thought about how she had been the camera for 4 hours. She got up. She turned on the overhead light in her living room. She looked at every corner of the room. There was no figure. She went to the kitchen. She turned on the light. She looked at every corner. There was no figure. She went to her bedroom. She turned on the light. She looked at every corner. There was no figure. She stood in her bedroom in her apartment on Angel Street in Providence, Rhode Island, at 3:17 in the morning of Saturday, the 17th of October, 2026. She said out loud, I know you are there. She said, I destroyed the reels. I destroyed the digital copies. I burned the USB. I threw the film in the river. She said, but I watched them. She waited. She said, I know you are here. She stood in the still of her bedroom. She waited for a long time. Nothing. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, she got up. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table. She looked at the corner of the kitchen by the refrigerator. There was nothing there. She looked at the corner of the living room by the window. There was nothing there. She looked at the corner of the bedroom by the closet. There was nothing there. She went to work. She did the Waterman Street estate. She finished the inventory. She finished the tags. She did the sale on the 24th of October. 1,200 people came through the house. The house was cleared. The proceeds were sent to Renard Yates in Chicago. Prendergast and Loyal sent Elsbeth's commission to her bank account. She kept working. She did other estates. She did a house in Cranston. She did a house on the east side. She did a condo in Warwick. She did not tell anyone about the reels. She did not tell Petrick. She did not tell her boss. She did not tell her sister in New Hampshire. Sometimes at night, she stood in a corner of her apartment and looked at the corner across the room. There was nothing there. There was never anything there. But she looked, in the way of a woman who had watched 12 reels of a family's home movies and had come to know the figure that had been in the background of every scene. Because she was not sure. She was not sure whether the figure had been the property of the Olestad family and had died with Mira in September. She was not sure whether the figure had been the property of the reels and had gone into the river with them. She was not sure whether the figure had been the property of whoever watched. She thought maybe it was the third thing. She thought maybe it was somewhere in her apartment. She thought maybe it was on the reckoning, in the room with her right now, standing in a corner, facing wherever she was. She could not see it. She would not, she thought, ever see it. But it was there. And it was going to be there for a long time. And she was going to live with it. That was the inheritance she had taken from the Olestad estate. Not the furniture, not the china, not the reels, the figure. She had earned it by watching. She went to work every morning. She did her estates. She came home every night. She looked at the corners of her apartment. There was nothing there. She lived that way. For a long time. Ren Couliard had lived in the town of Oker Springs, Kentucky, for 3 years, and on the first Sunday of November 2026, at 11:01 in the morning, she was walking down Poplar Street toward the post office when the bell at the First Baptist Church rang the 11 o'clock service. She stopped on the sidewalk. The bell was, on the sound of it, a big iron bell in the way of a bell that had been cast in the 1880s for a rural church in eastern Kentucky. The clapper was heavy. The tone was low and long. The bell rang 11 times. Wren stood on the sidewalk with her canvas bag on her shoulder and listened. After the 11th ring, she thought she heard, in the quiet that came after the bell, another sound. It was not part of the bell. It was. She could not name what it was. It was low. It was long. It was underneath what she could hear. She felt it more than heard it. It was, on the reckoning, a sound that seemed to come from the mountains east of town, up in the hollow that ran back into the Cumberland Plateau. It went on for maybe 8 seconds after the bell stopped. Then it stopped too. She stood on the sidewalk. She looked toward the mountains. She was, on the reckoning of a woman who had moved to Oker Springs 3 years ago from Louisville after her divorce, and had been trying to build a life in an eastern Kentucky town where she knew almost no one, aware that she had just heard something she had never heard before. She thought about it. She walked to the post office. She got her mail. She walked back home to her house on Sassafras Lane. She thought about the sound all afternoon. She could not, in the way, place it. It had been low. It had been long. It had been underneath. It had come from the direction of the mountains. She thought maybe it had been a train. There was a CC6 freight line that ran through the valley about 4 miles east of town, past the ridge, and freight trains did come through on Sunday mornings. She thought maybe it had been a truck on Highway 421, which ran east out of town toward Manchester. She thought maybe it had been a piece of mining equipment at one of the reclamation sites up in the hollow. But she thought, in the quiet way of a woman who had lived in Oker Springs long enough to know the sounds of the town and the mountains around it, that it had not been any of those things. She went to bed at 10. She did not sleep well. The following Sunday at 11, she went out onto her porch and listened. The bell at the First Baptist rang 11 times. Then, after the 11th ring, in the quiet, the other sound came. It was low. It was long. It was from the mountains. It went for 8 seconds. Then it stopped. Wren stood on her porch on Saspers Lane at 11:02 in the morning of Sunday, the 8th of November, 2026, and listened to the last of the sound as it faded. She said, out loud, "That is not a train." She went inside. She made a note in the small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She wrote, "Bell rings at 11. Then 8 seconds of low sound from the direction of the mountains. 2 Sundays in a row." She thought about it for the rest of the week. On Tuesday, she went to the library on the town square. She sat in the reading room and asked the librarian, a woman named Elith Fannin, who was maybe 70 and had been the librarian at Ochre Springs Public since 1978, if there was any local history about the First Baptist Church bell. Elith looked at her. Elith said, "The bell." Wren said, "Yes." "When was it cast?" Elith said, 1883. Cast in Louisville. Installed at the First Baptist that year. It has rung every Sunday morning at 11 since 1883. Wren said, 143 years. Elith said, "That's about right." Wren said, "Never missed a Sunday." Elith said, "Not to my knowledge." Wren said, "Even during the flu in 1918. Elith said, "Even then." Wren said, "During the Depression." Elith said, "Yes." Wren said, "During the war." Elith said, "Yes." Wren said, "During COVID." Elith looked at her for a moment. Elith said, "Yes." Wren said, Elith said, "Yes." Wren said, "Why?" Elith was quiet. Elith said, "Why what?" Wren said, "Why has it never missed a Sunday?" Elith said, "It is a tradition. In these towns we keep traditions." Wren said, "For 143 years without missing." Elith said, "Yes." Wren said, "Elith, last Sunday when the bell rang, I heard a sound from the mountains after it. A low sound. It lasted 8 seconds. I heard it again this Sunday." Elith looked at her for a long moment. Elith said, "Wren." Wren said, "Yes." Elith said, "Come sit with me in the back for a moment." They walked to the back of the library. There was a room where the library kept its microfilm reader and the archival boxes for the town's local history collection. Elith closed the door. Elith sat down at the reading table. She motioned for Wren to sit across from her. Elith said, "How long have you lived here, Wren?" Wren said, 3 years. Elith said, "You came from Louisville." Wren said, "Yes." Elith said, "After your divorce." Wren said, "Yes." Elith said, "You have a job." Wren said, "I work from home. Copy editing for a medical publisher." Elith said, "You live alone." Wren said, "Yes." Elith said, "You do not go to the First Baptist on Sundays." Wren said, "No." Elith said, "You do not go to any church." Wren said, "No." Elith said, "But you have come to hear the bell." Wren said, "You hear the bell in half the county. It's a loud bell." Elith said, "Yes." Elith said, "But you have come to hear the other thing." Wren said, "Yes." Elith looked at her. Elith said, "That is unusual for someone who has been in town only 3 years." Wren said, "What do you mean?" Elith said, "Most people who hear it have been in town a long time. Some are born here and hear it as children. Some come here as young people and hear it after they have been here 20 years. Some never hear it at all. Occasionally, somebody comes to town and hears it the first year. Those are the rare ones." Wren said, "Elith, what am I hearing?" Elith looked at Wren for a long time. Then Elith said, "Wren, there is a group of us in town. 9. at the moment. We meet on Sunday afternoons at Pearlie Wentz's house on Yalpon Street. We meet at 2. We drink coffee. We talk about what needs to be done for the coming week to make sure the bell is going to ring on Sunday. We have been meeting for a long time. Ren said, "How long?" Ilith said, "Since 1902. Different people, of course. It has passed down. There have always been about 9 or 10 of us at any given time. When one of us dies or moves away, another one starts to hear the sound, and that one comes to Pearlie's on a Sunday, and we bring them in." Ren said, "The people who hear it." Ilith said, "Yes." Ren said, "What are we hearing, Ilith?" Ilith said, "Ren, come to Pearlie's this Sunday at 2. If you come, we will tell you. We do not tell people who do not come. That is the arrangement." Ren said the address. Ilith said, 441 Yalpon. It's a greenhouse with a wraparound porch, 2 blocks north of the square. Come to the front door. Say you are here for the Sunday coffee. Pearlie will know. Ren said, "All right." Ilith said, Ren said, "Yes." Ilith said, "If you come, you are agreeing to consider joining us. If you do not want to consider joining us, do not come. Once we tell you, you are in the arrangement one way or another. It is easier for everyone if you come knowing." Ren said, "I will come knowing." Ilith said, "Good." They walked out of the back room. Ren checked out a book on the local history of Eastern Kentucky. She said goodbye. She walked home. She did not tell anyone about the meeting. She did not have anyone to tell. On Sunday, the 15th of November at 11, she went out onto her porch again. The bell rang 11 times. The sound from the mountains came. It lasted 8 seconds. It stopped. At 2, she walked to Pearlie Wentz's house on Yalpon Street. The house was a green frame with a wraparound porch and a garden in the front yard, where the last of the fall chrysanthemums were still blooming in a bed of dry mulch. Ren walked up the steps. She knocked on the front door. A woman opened the door. She was maybe 75. She had gray hair in a bun. She was wearing a dark blue cardigan over a house dress. Ren said, "I'm Ren Kuyar. I'm here for the Sunday coffee." Pearlie Wentz said, "Come in, dear." Ren went in. The house was warm. There was a coal stove in the front parlor. There was the smell of coffee and something baked with cinnamon. There were 8 people in the parlor. Ilith was among them. Ren looked at the 8 people. They were mostly older, 60 and up. There was one younger man, maybe 40, sitting on the arm of a couch. There was one middle-aged woman, maybe 50, sitting in a straight chair by the window. Pearlie said, "Everyone, this is Ren Kuyar. She has been hearing the sound." Ilith brought her in. The 8 people nodded. A few said hello. Pearlie brought Ren a cup of coffee. Ilith said, "Ren, sit down." Ren sat down in a wing chair by the fireplace. Pearlie said, "Ren, before we tell you, we want to say a few things." Ren said, "All right." Pearlie said, "First, you are not going to be asked to do anything strange. You are not going to be asked to give money. You are not going to be asked to go anywhere at night. You are not going to be asked to lie to anyone about anything." Ren said, "All right." Pearlie said, "Second, what we are going to tell you is going to sound in the way that these things sound. We are all aware of how it sounds. We are asking you to listen to the end before you decide." Ren said, "All right." Pearlie said, "Third, you are free to leave at any point during the telling. You are free to walk out the door and never come back. We would ask that you not tell anyone what you have heard. We have found over the years that people who leave and do not tell are quiet about it, out of the way people are quiet about things they do not understand." Ren said, All right. Pearlie said. Fourth, if you decide to join us, you would be committing to come to this house on Sunday afternoons at 2, for as long as you live in Ochre Springs. You would be committing to help with whatever practical things needed to be done to keep the bell ringing on Sunday mornings. Some of us take turns making sure the bell mechanism is working. Some of us keep the church itself in repair. Some of us make sure there is a pastor to ring it. It is practical work, but it is regular. Wren said, all right. Pearlie said, fifth, if you decide not to join us, the sound will still come. You will still hear it. You will hear it for the rest of your life. That does not go away. We have found that people who hear the sound and do not come to us tend to have a harder time with it than people who come to us, because they are hearing it alone, and because they do not know what it means. Wren said, all right. Pearlie said, are you ready? Wren said, yes. Pearlie sat down across from her. Elith sat down beside Pearlie. The other 7 people were quiet. Pearlie said, in 1882, a man named Aaron Wentz, my great-great-grandfather, was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Ochre Springs. The church had been founded in 1864, after the war, by a group of families who had come into this valley from Virginia. There was no bell. The church was a building at the north end of what is now the town square. Services were held on Sunday mornings at 11. Pearlie drank her coffee. Pearlie said in the summer of 1882 something started happening in the hollow east of town. A number of children went missing. 3 in June, 2 in July, 1 in early August, all from the homesteads that were up in the hollow, back where the branch of the Poor Fork comes down out of the plateau. The homesteaders were a community, maybe 8 or 10 families. They did not know what was taking their children. They were not able to find any trace of them. Pearlie said, the homesteaders came to Aaron Wentz. They asked for his help. He went up into the hollow with them. He spent 3 days there. What he saw or heard or came to know, he did not write down. He did not tell his family or his congregation. But he came back to town with an understanding. Pearlie said, he came back and he said the church needed a bell. He said the bell needed to be a big iron bell. He said it needed to be rung every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, and it needed to never miss a Sunday. He said if it missed a Sunday, the thing that had been taking children in the hollow would come out of the hollow and into the town. Pearlie said he raised the money for the bell. He had it cast in Louisville. He installed it in the tower of the First Baptist Church in the fall of 1883. The first Sunday it rang was the 4th of November, 1883. Pearlie said, from that Sunday to this Sunday, it has never missed. That is 143 years. Pearlie said, in the years since, the thing in the hollow has taken no more children. It has not come into the town. It has stayed in the hollow. It answers the bell every Sunday. When the bell rings, the thing in the hollow makes its own sound. 8 seconds of a low tone. That is what you have been hearing. Pearlie said, some of us hear it. Most people do not. Pearlie said, Aaron Wentz began the meeting at this house in 1902, 20 years after the bell was installed. He had noticed that a few people in town were hearing the answer. He also had noticed that the bell had begun to have mechanical issues that needed regular tending, and he had been tending it himself. But he was getting old. He wanted people who heard the answer to help him. He wanted them to know why. Pearlie said he brought together 7 people. They started meeting here at his house on Sunday afternoons. When Aaron Wentz died in 1911, his daughter Pearl Wentz, my great-grandmother, for whom I am named, took over the meeting. When Pearl died in 1949, her daughter Pauline took over. When Pauline died in 1992, her daughter Mildred took over. When Mildred died in 2018, I took over. Pearlie said, "That is the long form. The short form is, we are the ones who make sure the bell rings on Sunday. Wren, you are being asked to join us, if you would like to." Wren sat in the wing chair by the fireplace at 441 Yopin Street in Oker Springs, Kentucky, at 2:22 in the afternoon of Sunday, the 15th of November, 2026, and looked at Pearlie once. She said, "The thing in the hollow." Pearlie said, "Yes." Wren said, "What is it?" Pearlie said, "We do not know." Wren said, "You have been keeping it in the hollow for 143 years, and you do not know what it is." Pearlie said, "That is correct." Wren said, "Has anyone gone into the hollow to look?" Pearlie said, "In the arrangement of what Aaron Wentz worked out with it. None of us goes into the hollow. It stays there. We stay here. The bell rings on Sunday. The arrangement holds." Wren said, "What happens if the bell does not ring on Sunday?" Pearlie was quiet for a moment. Pearlie said, "Wren, in August of 1954, the mechanism of the bell failed at 10:47 in the morning. My grandmother, Pauline, was at the church that morning. She and her sister, Ethel, had been checking the bell every Sunday morning at 10. They saw that a part of the mechanism had cracked. Pauline sent Ethel to fetch a man in town, a machinist named Corbin Thrace, who was one of us. Ethel ran to Corbin's house. Corbin came with a tool bag. Between them, Pauline and Corbin repaired the mechanism at 10:58. The bell rang at 11. It rang 11 times. Pearlie said, between the failure at 10:47 and the repair at 10:58, my aunt, Sedna Wentz, was in the yard behind her house on Buckthorn Street. She was 6. She was playing with a doll. My great-uncle Mott Wentz saw a shape at the tree line at the back of the yard. He ran into the yard and picked up Sedna and carried her into the house. He and my great-aunt Rowena barred the door. They stayed in the parlor with Sedna for the rest of the day. Nothing came in. But my great-uncle Mott, who was a quiet man who did not talk about things he did not want to talk about, described the shape at the tree line to my grandmother Pauline that evening. He said it was in the shape of a tall, thin figure with an incorrect number of joints in its arms. Pearlie said, Sedna lived to be 82. She died in 2030. Pearlie corrected herself. Pearlie said, in 2003. My apologies. She died in 2003. Pearlie said, the bell has not failed since 1954. We work hard to make sure it does not. Wren sat in the wing chair. She looked at the 8 people in the parlor. She looked at Illith. She looked at Pearlie. She said, the sound I hear after the bell. Pearlie said, yes. Wren said, it is the thing acknowledging the bell. Pearlie said, that is what we believe. Wren said, it is saying, I heard the bell. I am still here. I am not coming into the town. Pearlie said, that is what we believe. Wren said, you have been keeping it in the hollow for 143 years. Pearlie said, yes. Wren said, does the town know? Pearlie said, the town does not know. The town knows there is a bell. The town knows the bell rings on Sunday. The town does not know why. Aaron Wentz did not want the town to know. He believed knowing would make it worse. He believed the arrangement worked because only some people were aware of it. Wren said, why does it work that way? Pearlie said, we do not know. Wren said, there is a lot you do not know. Pearlie said, there is. Wren said, but the bell rings every Sunday. Pearlie said, the bell rings every Sunday. Wren said, and the thing stays in the hollow. Pearlie said, the thing stays in the hollow. Wren was quiet for a while. She looked into the fireplace. She thought about her 3 years in Oker Springs. She thought about her house on Sassafras Lane. She thought about her copy editing job for the medical publisher. She thought about her small vegetable garden and her small handful of friends, and the quiet life she had come to make for herself since Louisville. She thought about the fact that she had been hearing the sound for 2 Sundays. She thought about the fact that she was going to hear it every Sunday for the rest of her life. She thought about being alone with it. She thought about being in a room with 8 other people who had been alone with it too. She looked at Pearlie. She said, "I will join." Pearlie said, "Wren." Wren said, "Yes." Pearlie said, "Thank you." Edith said, "Welcome." Wren. The others said, "Welcome." Wren said, "What do I do?" Pearlie said, "For now, you come to Sunday coffee at 2. You listen for a few weeks. You get to know us. In a few months, we will start giving you small tasks, helping with the mechanism check, helping with the pastor's schedule, helping with the church's roof, or its heating, or its lawn. You will pick up the rhythm of what needs to be done." Wren said, "All right." Pearlie said, Wren said, "Yes." Pearlie said, "You are going to be one of us for a long time." The people who hear the answer tend to live long lives. That is one of the things we have noticed. Edith is 79. I am 75. Mildred lived to 101. We are not sure why, but we have come to think of it as a gift from the arrangement. Wren said, "A small gift." Pearlie said, "Yes." Wren said, "From the thing in the hollow." Pearlie said, "We believe so." Wren was quiet. Wren said, "It is grateful to us." Pearlie said, "We believe so." Wren said, "For keeping the bell ringing." Pearlie said, "For keeping the arrangement." Wren nodded slowly. She said, "All right." Pearlie said, "There is coffee. There is Marma Wentz's cinnamon cake. Sit for a while. Meet everyone." Wren sat. She ate a piece of cake. She drank a cup of coffee. She talked to the 8 people in the parlor. They were farmers and machinists and retired school teachers, and one woman who ran the small dry cleaners on the town square. They were friendly. They were the friendly people of an eastern Kentucky town. They were also, she was aware, the people who had been keeping something in a hollow for 143 years. She sat with them for 2 hours. At 4:15, she walked home to Sassafras Lane. The Sunday afternoon was cool and clear. The light was going down early, the way it did in November. She walked past the storefronts of the town square. She walked past the First Baptist Church, which was on the corner of Poplar and Ashwood. She looked up at the bell tower. The bell was up there. It was, on the look of it, a big iron bell. She could see it through the arched openings of the tower. It hung on a wood frame. It had a rope going down through a hole in the ceiling of the belfry to the pulling station in the church. It had been there since 1883. She looked at it. She said, out loud, in the quiet of Poplar Street at 4:27, in the afternoon of Sunday, the 15th of November, 2026. Hello, the bell was quiet. She walked home. She got to Sassafras Lane at 4:33. She went inside. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table and looked out the window at her yard. She thought about the sound. She thought about the thing in the hollow. She thought about the fact that the sound had been there every Sunday since 1883, and that she had only started hearing it 2 Sundays ago, and that she was going to hear it for the rest of her life, and that she now knew what it was, and that she was, on the reckoning, one of the 9 people in a Kentucky town who were keeping an old thing in a hollow by ringing a bell every Sunday morning at 11. She thought about that. She was not, on the reckoning, afraid. She was, in the way, at peace. She had been alone in Ochre Springs for 3 years. She had been alone since her divorce for 5 years before that. She had been alone in Louisville in the last years of her marriage before that. She had, on the reckoning, been alone for a long time. She was not alone anymore. She was one of 9. They would meet at Pearlie's next Sunday at 2. They would meet the Sunday after that. They would meet every Sunday for the rest of her life. They would drink coffee. They would talk about the bell. They would keep the bell ringing. The thing in the hollow would stay in the hollow. The town would not know. The arrangement would hold. Wren drank her tea. She sat at her kitchen table and looked out at her yard as the November light went down over Ochre Springs. At 5:42, the sun set behind the ridge, west of town. The dark came down. The streetlights came on. The chimney smoke of the houses along Sassafras Lane rose into the evening sky. The town settled into the quiet of a Kentucky evening in November. Wren sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she got up. She made supper. She ate. She washed the dish. She read a book by the front window. She went to bed at 10. She slept well. She was, in the reckoning of a woman who had come to a small town 3 years ago and had, on the occasion of hearing something in the mountains, come to belong there, home, she was going to keep the bell ringing for the rest of her life. That was the work. She was going to do it well.